What is the Matrix? Control. The Matrix is a computer-generated dream world, built to keep us under control in order to change a human being into this.
He's the author of many books, and his latest article is Martial Law, the Financial Bailout and War. It's Peter Dale Scott. Thank you for joining us, sir.
I'm glad to be back. Hi there.
Well, let's just get right into it. I mean, in the very beginning of this article, you not only talk about Paulson and the bailout there, but you also talk about how Congress was strong-armed into initially passing this because the initial bailout did fail, and then it was reproposed. And after a few members, including Inhofe and Sherman, were threatened with martial law, it magically passed, didn't it, Peter?
Yes, well, there was an atmosphere of threats used on Congress. I think that the bailout was ill-advised, certainly in the form that it was. And, of course, the excuse that was used was that they had to act immediately. But I think a test of the what is really bad about this bailout law is it's a means for taking public funds and giving them to enrich the rich after they had made very disastrous investments, which went sour. And instead of moral hazard applying and they're having to pay for it, we are stepping in to pay. And it may be that something like this has to be done, but it should have been done with restraints, for example, to tell them that they can't go on paying these outrageous bonuses for their misdeeds, that they cannot continue to distribute dividends. You know, 85% of the stock in this country is owned by the richest 10% in the country. So if you pass a public law to guarantee the continuation of dividends to banks, which in fact are losing money badly, you're using the public treasury to enrich the rich. And that's a symptom of what's really wrong in this country, I think, that wealth has taken control of both parties. And it was the influence of wealth that drove that legislation through. And it's, of course, just happening again right now. And it's not quite over because, once again, it will go into conference committee. And I think this time they're intending to cut off bonuses and intending to cut off dividends. But I think we should watch very closely to see if this actually happens when the final bill is signed.
Well, there's definitely some political grandstanding now going on as the administrations are about to switch. I mean, now for the first time I'm seeing the media report, conservatives ask if bailout is unconstitutional. And I would say, yes, it's absolutely unconstitutional. But now the mainstream is going to make this into a right-left argument, especially with the House Democrats now proposing a $825 billion stimulus bill. I mean, is there any end in sight to these bailout packages, to these stimulus bills? I mean, what do you see happening in the next 6 months?
Well, I think I've always been uninclined to predict the future. I think it's an easy way to make big mistakes, but particularly right now. We really are going into people point back to the Depression of the 1930s as an example of where we've been before. But I think we're possibly in an even worse crisis than we were then. And one thing for sure is that America's profile in the world is greater than it was, so that the world will suffer more acutely. Yes, the short answer to your question is absolutely there's going to be more and more bailing out, trillions of dollars. People have estimated up to $8.5 trillion. Mm-hmm. Some of it will be done through Congress, and a lot of it's going to be done, already has been done, a trillion or more, has been done through the Federal Reserve. And people should understand that what the Federal Reserve does is using our money, but they don't go to Congress. They're using the powers that were granted them decades ago. And it's completely secret. There's no accountability. And you get the irony that Bloomberg, who's a billionaire, his company is suing the Federal Reserve to force them to say what they've been doing with our money. And you really have reached a point where it's no longer democracy if there's taxation without representation going on through the Federal Reserve. So there are left, right, and center in every direction, the treatment of the banks, treatment of the big multinational corporations. We're going to see huge bailouts with a minimum of control, and I think all we can do from outside is to insist. Here are the things that we should insist on. One, as much transparency as possible. There was really no transparency in the first bailout, Paulson's bailout. Mm-hmm. And what I think is a vital criterion is democracy is suffering right now because we're getting, for about 30 years now, we've been getting rapidly increasing disparity between wealth and poverty in this country. The rich there are ways of measuring this, and America has become, of all the Western countries, probably the leading example of extreme disparity between wealth and poverty. And the criterion that should be applied to every law that's passed and all these bailouts is, will it diminish the disparity of wealth and income in this country, or will it increase it? And if it increases it, it's a bad law. And that, I think, is something, it's a sign of the problem that this obvious criterion has hardly been invoked. It has come up, I think, with the auto industry. I think it's perfectly obvious that if you're going to ask the workers to accept less in their paycheck, then you should ask the people who probably are being overpaid at the top to accept less too, particularly because it was their failure of leadership that led into this crisis. Does that not make sense?
I absolutely agree with you, and it's just disgusting how, you know, like you said, the upper echelon continue to rake in the bonuses, still have these massive salaries in the hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars in most cases. And like you said, it's going to be the common worker who loses his pension, who loses his 401k, who loses his benefits, and may not even have a job, because I really don't see the auto industry surviving another year in this country. We don't make anything left. And there's nothing we make in this country. The last thing was cars, and that's about to end. And going back to what you said about
it's not quite as bad as that. I think we're pretty good in high tech.
Well, that's true.
We've outsourced a lot of it, but the central leadership of that industry is...
Yeah, but most of it's still built in India or China.
Yes, a lot of the jobs have gone, but the America is... you know, now we're talking about something that's been happening over 50 years, and that is that we've put so much emphasis on maintaining our military that we've allowed civilian leadership civilian industry and the civilian economy to migrate to other countries. And one of the things that we have to say about this bailout is that the crisis it faced should have been faced much earlier. And worse than that, the states they addressed the problem of predatory lending, which is at the heart of it, because here were very unscrupulous companies going out and hard selling mortgages to people who they knew couldn't sustain them, particularly because these were variable mortgages that would start with a very reasonable rate, but which they intended to jack up to 11, 12, 15% usurious rates. They knew that this was all a phony operation, and that this is where the big banks are culpable, because they first of all, they lobbied for Congress to make it easier to do this sort of thing, for them to invest in it, and then they packaged all these mortgages into securities which they sold all over the world. So that's why we have a world crisis now based on the failure in or the downturn in the American housing market. Little innocent countries like Iceland, who have done no wrong to anybody, are suffering terribly because the banking system of the world has supported this bubble and now is having to pay for it everywhere, every part of the world. There's one other thing. You could easily, in legislation, establish a principle of some kind of ratio between the richest return and the poorest in any business. So if a worker in an industry is getting, I don't know, shall we say, $30,000 a year, you establish a limit, maybe 20 times that, which would be the maximum that anybody in that industry can make. And this has been kicked around for some years as a solution to the problem of disparity of income. But I'm not sure that our two parties that are so heavily subsidized by the wealthy are going to put that into legislation, but they should. So just say 20 times as much as the basic pay is the most that anybody can make in any industry. Is that not reasonable?
It seems reasonable to guys like you and me, but to the global elite, that's going to cut into their profit margin quite a bit.
Yeah, it scares them, exactly. And that's what we learned in the bailout last fall, is how vigorously they fought to maintain their bonuses and maintain their dividends, even though they're lucky not to be in jail, some of those people. And some of them actually still, not just Madoff, and a number of other people.
I think they're super lucky. It's the Alex Jones Show. We'll be back with Peter Dale Scott, Infowars.com.